We very often hear reference to the fact that 7 years ago, the then Minister for Health, Simon Harris, gave a commitment that no child would wait more than 4 months for spinal surgery. And it is worth reminding ourselves of that fact and that empty promise that was made. But that same commitment was given by the current Minister for Health 2 years ago, as I'm sure you'll recall, Minister. But those commitments have never been honoured. In fact, the situation has only gotten worse. We now have at least 327 children on a waiting list for scoliosis surgery. That is a 5% increase on 2017, when Minister Harris first announced his target. All these years later, what is the target for children with scoliosis now, Minister? It seems that this government is simply incapable of getting to grips with this issue. Last year, the Taoiseach said that he wanted Ireland to be, quote, the best country in Europe to be a child, end quote. Those words ring very hollow for children with spina bifida and scoliosis. This government's inaction and inability to get to grips with this issue has a direct impact on the health of those children. It's not abstract for them or their families. The longer these children wait, the more their spines curve, the more their organs are crushed, and the more their chances of survival diminish. This is why real strategic action is required, and it's well overdue. This cannot be allowed to turn into a perennial problem. This government should be doing everything possible in its power, if necessary, identifying other sources of funding. And there's been a lot of criticism about where funding is going in terms of different directions. There's a lot of money available in this country. And if this is not a top priority, I don't know what is. After all, we're talking about some of the most vulnerable children in our society. It is frankly unforgivable that they are being denied their most basic rights. In a rich country like ours, with an €8 billion surplus, there can be no justification for this failure to provide the necessary services. Parents and children should not have to fight and plead for treatment, yet that is exactly what they have been forced to do for years now. Again and again, we are both disturbed and moved by the plight of children waiting years for surgery. They share their stories in an effort to secure treatment and surgery and advocate for others. But they shouldn't have to do that. They shouldn't have to take to the streets again. This government has simply left them with no other option. These are some of the most medically challenged children in the country, and they've been repeatedly failed by successive ministers for health and indeed CHI. Trust has now completely broken down since last year's revelations about spinal surgeries in Temple Street. Many thought that scandal would surely be a catalyst for change, for an accelerated response, but regrettably that has not happened. At the beginning of this month, we learned that the independent review into Temple Street had been widened to include 17 further cases of concern. While inevitably this will delay the completion of the report, it is very disappointing that no updated timeline has been provided, and I'd ask the Minister to do that tonight. Last week, I received a PQ reply from the Minister about this, and he seemed to be using the independence of the review as some kind of excuse for not providing an indicative timeline. However, when I raised the reporting timeline with him last September, he said that, quote, nobody will be waiting a year for a view from Dr. Nayagam and this review, end quote. He also committed to interim reviews and said that the review was being set up in such a way as to ensure that pressing clinical issues would be reported on in 2023. Again, those were just empty promises. Even with the discovery of new cases, I cannot understand why we haven't heard anything from this review. What happened to the interim reports, Minister? In respect of the task force, I do welcome the Minister's commitment to establish one. The structure of this must be informed by the views and position of advocacy groups, and the Social Democrats fully support the call in this motion for it to be independent of CHI management and the mandate on them to listen, engage and act on the advice and concerns of parents, patient advocates and clinicians. I would also like to state my strong support for the inclusion of paediatric urology in this motion and the specific call for a suitable location for the elective paediatric urology service. I heard Senator Tom Clonan speak about these waiting lists last week. He gave a harrowing account of children with disabilities being left to languish on urological surgery waiting lists while their urinary continence, fecal continence and sexual development suffered due to a lack of critical intervention. This is completely unacceptable, Minister. How can you stand over a situation where 81% of children are waiting longer than the Sláintecare target time for inpatient paediatric urology, while 72% are waiting longer than the target time for outpatient paediatric urology? It's indefensible. This is clearly an overlooked area of healthcare, despite the severe implications for patients as a result of inadequate services. This can include the loss of renal function, loss of genital and sexual function, infertility, higher rates of urological cancers, increased levels of morbidity, psychological disorders, and in some cases, even more serious outcomes. This area of medicine is a very, very sensitive and personal one, and that is why we need appropriately trained and qualified paediatric urologists. In 2019, a model of care for urology was published by the RCSI in partnership with the HSE. Amongst its findings was that Ireland had one of the lowest ratios of accredited urologists in the Western world. At the time, Ireland had 37 urologists. While that number had increased to 51 by 2022, that still only represents 40% of what New Zealand had and only 20% of what Denmark had, both of these countries having similarly sized populations to ourselves. That same model of care recommended national and regional centres of excellence for subspecialist urology, such as complex paediatric urology. To deal with the deficit in paediatric urologists, the report also recommended that all new or replacement urology posts for the next 15 to 20 years should have a component of paediatric urology in the job description. Can the Minister please let us know the status of this report and the implementation of these recommendations? One would be forgiven for assuming that this is just another report left to gather dust on a shelf. Finally, there are just too many devastating impacts of this government's inaction on paediatric, orthopaedics and urology. However, taken as a whole, they amount to one thing: a theft of childhood. While these children wait in limbo, getting sicker and sicker, they are denied many aspects and many parts of a normal childhood. Year after year, this state has utterly failed in its obligations to these children. All the while, they continue to suffer unimaginable pain. There can be no further excuses. It's time for action and accountability. Minister, the counter motion which you have tabled tonight is completely disappointing. It just doesn't seem to get the scale and the nature of the challenge that is facing you now and what you need to act on. Nothing less than urgent action in this area, and delivery on your promises would be acceptable.